Kia ora everyone, welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we've seen the latest labour market statistics really wrong foot again, economists. Expectations for the unemployment rate to fall from that 3.2% down to 3.1, maybe 3. Some expectations were for 2.8. At a time when we know the labour market is incredibly stretched, there's a huge amount of challenge still coming through there. Actually, it went up very slightly to 3.3%. Now, really, that was a bit of a rude shock given all those expectations were so strong on it to decline. But looking through the numbers, I think we need to sort of pull back that expectation a touch of it getting catastrophically worse. Realistically, that small increase to 3.3, a little bit of volatility that you always get with a survey like the Household Labour Force survey, but also looking into it, what we have seen is that there were a lot more people that were sick across the quarter. Of course, that was expected partially because of COVID-19. What did come through, though, is a lot more people weren't wanting to look for work because they were sick in the quarter, more than we've seen before. And I think what you're starting to see there relative to the start of the year, remembering that the Omicron peak throughout March happened in March, but after 2 months, January and February, not having nearly as much disruption. You come through into the second quarter of the year, though, the one we've just had, and you've had 100,000 New Zealanders each and every day out with COVID-19 or as a close household contact, and that's before you get to the flu and the other seasonal illnesses. So I think you did see some of that sickness starting to come through. That popped the unemployment rate very slightly higher. The concern, I guess, wider is that still the labour market is under a huge amount of pressure. When it comes to employment, what are we seeing at the moment?
Yeah, there's a lot of anecdotes from businesses across the board about just how hard it is to find staff. With the borders moving towards reopening and the government looking to process more visas, there is some hope there from people that does start to ease some of the constraints around the labour supply. But we also are aware that it is quite difficult to actually get people through that visa process. So not necessarily a lot of change coming through. I mean, employment for the quarter was flat again, and that's the third quarter in a row that it hasn't really moved. And it's not because businesses are not taking on staff or wanting to take on staff. It is literally that there is no one out there really to take on with that unemployment rate so low. So, whether it's 3.3 or 3.2%, it is still, as you say, an incredibly tight labour market, and supply is just not there to meet that demand in terms of what we're trying to produce and who we're trying to employ. So incredibly tight, and I think that's starting to flow through now in terms of some of the wage rate numbers that we've seen. I think average hourly earnings were up 6.4% from where they were a year ago, and if we look at that series, it's the highest it's been on record. That goes back to the late 1980s. I suspect sometime back in the 1980s, if you had another piece of data, you'd see it stronger than that. So real signs of that picking up, and I think that's reflected in some of those other labour market, labour cost rates that have come through as well.
Absolutely. I mean, we're starting to see that the signs of sort of a wage war emerging because people are having to put some pretty serious cash on the table to both attract and probably more importantly retain their current workers. Now, that's been an expectation we've held for a while, but the latest numbers really have confirmed it. Now, you noted that 6.4% increase in average hourly earnings, remembering that the expectation from the market and the Reserve Bank was for that figure to be 5.7, 5.8%. So 6.4 really is quite a boost on top of that. The other numbers that we look through on an adjusted basis, the labour cost index, so accounting for both the quality and quantity of labour being utilised, up to 3.4% on an annual basis. Again, the fastest since 2008, since the global financial crisis came through, but just before that, before you had quite a strong bout of inflation moving ahead. More importantly, when we look at the unadjusted labour cost index, which allows for some recognition of promotions and similar, that's running at 5.1%, the fastest on record going back to the 90s. And really what I think that shows is that you are seeing a huge amount of competition when it comes to wage rates and similar, but also that businesses are trying to find as many different ways as possible to entice and retain people. So it's not just the pay rates, but it's also giving people promotions and thinking about leave balances and similar, trying to do everything possible to put on the table, those options alongside the likes of training incentives to try and upskill people. So all of those measures, either at record highs or at decade high levels, continuing to push that expectation that wage rises are coming forward. What does all this mean from the Reserve Bank's point of view? Because although these wage pressures aren't currently fueling inflation, realistically, if businesses are currently starting to push on cost increases, those cost increases when it comes to their labour costs are surely going to drive higher domestic inflation as we move forward.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, labour costs have sort of lagged the pickup in inflation over the last 12 months or so, and that's what we would have anticipated. But now there is that catch up there. And businesses, while they won't be entirely happy with having to pay 6.5% more to their workers, that is, like you say, a steep increase. The reality is they've got a whole lot of other cost increases that have been feeding through over the last year. And this is just one more on top of that. And they will know that they have been able to pass on those cost increases, and there's an expectation that they will be able to pass on these labour cost pressures going forward from here. Of course, the risk then for the Reserve Bank and the economy more generally is that we don't start to see inflation coming down from its peak particularly quickly, because you've got this sort of rolling ball of different cost pressures and increases coming through and continuing to keep inflation well outside the top of the Reserve Bank's target band. So, yeah, the labour market is still tight, and the Reserve Bank will be particularly uncomfortable, I think, with the expectation that wage growth continues to roll on at such strong levels, and that will keep the pressure on them to keep raising interest rates.
Absolutely. And look, that pressure, like you say, very much remains. In fact, particularly with no real growth in employment in recent times, the total number of hours being worked in the economy has still been increasing. So we're still trying to push people to their limits in terms of expectations. But again, there's only so long you can do that before you start to run the economy into a rough patch, because people are going to sort of lose energy, and all of those pay increases are going to come home to roost. We'll assess where the labour market moves and how those wage rates evolve. Probably more importantly, what the Reserve Bank decides to do into or across the rest of the year. And we'll assess those various shifts on our next edition of Econ Talks.